Welcome to the conference. I'm looking forward to this very much. My name is Tom Donnelly, and along with my colleague Gary Schmidt, who'll be moderating the afternoon, or the final panel. We are in charge of the Security Studies program here at AEI, but today we're really partnering with our good friend and colleague Sally Sattel, who is really the motivating factor behind the conference and who will be the moderating the first panel. So I'm going to get off the stage as quickly as possible, but I just want to begin with a couple of housekeeping notes in case anybody may have missed it. The need for Mike Coffman to cast votes in the House of Representatives today has thrown a bit of a monkey wrench in the schedule, but not one that we didn't anticipate and can't adapt to. So we're going to do, after I get off, we'll do our first panel. Then Mr. Coffman will speak roughly about 1:15. He'll give some remarks and we'll take some questions. And then we'll conclude with the second panel. So that's what you're in for over the next couple of hours. But more broadly speaking, I think the purpose of the conference is something that's long overdue and much needed in our public policy conversation. It's become a commonplace for us to thank veterans for their service, but we don't do as much thinking about what their service entails as we ought to. And the conference that Sally has put together is very much in that spirit, particularly looking at the trends in disability and post-traumatic stress treatment and asking the hard questions that really haven't been asked as vigorously as they should have been, particularly over the last decade. So we're going to explore what can be done to better integrate and return veterans to society prepared for success, rather than with the idea that we need to treat them for the disabilities that we all sort of worry that they've picked up during their time in uniform. So this is a very almost diametrically opposed to what the conventional wisdom has been since 9/11, and something that may have been beyond the capability and the capacity of the Veterans Administration, which is in danger of turning into the Victims Administration. And so we're going to try to sort of invert or turn the telescope around and ask ourselves, what can be done not simply to ameliorate the parts of service that break people, but also to accentuate the parts of military service that make people better, make them grow, and make them better citizens than they would have been otherwise. So that concludes my introductory remarks. I want to say a few things about Sally, because again, this is really her initiative. Sally's not a big person, but she's got a big brain, and most of all, or equally, a big heart. She's not afraid to, has never been afraid to challenge conventional wisdom, either within the medical community or the policy community. And so on behalf of the Security Studies program here, we very much welcome Sally's initiatives in this regard, and I look very much forward to the panel. Sally, the microphone is yours.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for that lovely introduction. Well, everyone else on this panel is not afraid to challenge orthodoxy either, and that's why I invited them. So welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming. I'm sure that a lot, if not all of you, are here because you have a sense that our current VA Veterans Disability System is broken and in need of some reform. But first, let me say what the problem is not. It is not a problem for wounded veterans to get government aid for their wounds, psychological and physical, and certainly not even income maintenance if they've reached a point where they're not able to participate in the workforce. That's not the problem. The problem is the way the system is inadvertently designed to divert young veterans, men and women of both, with strong recovery potential away from reintegrating into the workforce and into society as fully as they can. That's the problem, and that's what the speakers are going to talk about today. My personal insight into this comes from an experience really now over 20 years old, when I worked at the West Haven VA early in my training in psychiatry. And even then, obviously, it was a different generation. It was a Vietnam-era veterans. But we saw the problems then with perverse incentives that pulled people into disability when they did have potential to recover, if not fully, certainly to recover to a point where they could participate significantly and be productive. And we're seeing it now as well. So let me introduce people. Our speakers will lay out the landscape here. Now, there's much more detail on their accomplishments online, so I'm going to be very abbreviated and say that the first speaker, Chris Free, is a clinical psychologist. He's professor of psychology and chair of Division of Social Sciences at the University of Hawaii at Hilo. He's one of the most, in my view, measured and important clinical voices on the need for reform in veterans' disability. And a fun fact, he's also a series of historical crime novels, writing as Christopher Bartley. And he has like 500 million Twitter followers. It's just staggering, actually. So Chris will set out the nature of the disability system, talk more about the perversities in it, and of course, well-meaning, but the incentives are in the wrong direction. Talk a tiny bit about what PTSD is, although I'm sure most people know, and what these what the incentives that veterans are presented with, and the messages that they're presented with at the moment of transition. These veterans are at a crossroads, and what these kinds of influences can mean for their future professional and personal life. Then we'll move on with Dr. Deborah Beidel to a constructive treatment program for veterans diagnosed with PTSD. She is the Pegasus Professor of Psychology and Medical Education at the University of Central Florida, and she'll again talk about the results of her program. She's an expert on anxiety and stress disorders. Panel 2, just a bit of a preview, we'll talk a lot more about transition services for veterans. This is kind of the diagnostic panel, and next we'll get to the therapeutic panel, although Deborah will be talking therapy as well in a research setting. And then we'll go from this to the effect of disability entitlement for veterans on their entry into the workforce. Professor Mark Duggan is the Trione Director of Stanford Institute for Economic Policy and Research. He is also the Wayne and Jody Cooperman Professor of Economics at Stanford University. His research explores the effect of disability programs beyond veterans' compensation, including Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid on the labor market. But today he's going to talk about veterans. In other words, he's going to basically show us what happens when recovery-oriented services are not provided to new veterans, and when the expectations to return to productive life, in some capacity, even if not full capacity, when these kinds of expectations are not part of the culture of transition to civilian life. So we'll start with you, Chris.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to give an overview of the VA system's disability policies and kind of put into context why they're tragically iatrogenic. And I'm going to make 5 points in providing an overview of the problem. First will be the dramatically rising number of disability claims, the fact that the disability policy designed in 1914 is now over 100 years old and is woefully obsolete, the problems for the VA system and for science that this poses and creates, the tragically harmful effect on veterans and their families, and then number 5, the tragically harmful effect on our entire society and our nation. Those are the 5 things I'm going to hit on, and I'll go through each of these real briefly. First of all, we have rising numbers of disability claims that are actually kind of astonishing when you put them into historical context. The World War II veterans, on average, applied for 2 conditions, but only 11% of them applied. So of the World War II veterans who applied, of the 11% who applied, they applied for 2 conditions. Vietnam veterans applied for 4 conditions, and 16% of them applied. We're now the OIF, OEF generation. We're at about 50%. I don't have the most up-to-date numbers, but it might even be a little above 50%. And the average is 9 conditions. So World War II, 11% applied for disability for 2 conditions. OIF, OEF, 50% have applied for disability, 9 conditions. So we see a societal shift, a cultural shift in the role this plays. And just to lay it out, the 3 most common disabilities are number 1, ringing in the ears, number 2, hearing loss, and 3 is post-traumatic stress disorder. The disability policy itself was designed over 100 years ago, a very different time and place, and so it's really not in line with current science or technology that we have available to us. The current model is adversarial because veterans are applying and then they're in an adversarial relationship with the VA to make their case and prove their case. It's inflexible, which means veterans are, they don't want to lose their disability and they don't want to lose the opportunity when they separate from the military not to have those disability on every possible conditions because they fear the trouble they may have getting it later if they need it. So it's inflexible. It's slow. It often takes 6 months to 2 years, and veterans will often reapply if they don't get the full 100%. And then the incentives are misplaced. So rather than having recovery and work incentives, we have disincentives to those sorts of things. And Mark will be talking about that. A few problems this creates for the VA. There's quite a bit of fraud and abuse, which means misallocation of resources. I don't think there's any question about that. It's a wide open secret within the VA. You can talk to any frontline clinician, and they will comment on that. Deborah will talk a little bit about that in the context of her treatment research. There's no known VA administrative data showing effectiveness of PTSD programs. In other words, the VA spends billions of dollars on mental health care, but we don't know if it works because we've never seen the data to show that it works. And virtually nobody comes off disability once they're on it. Is that a fair statement, Thomas? It's probably less than 1%. It's a fraction of 1%. The research data on treatment for PTSD in veterans is very different from the research data on PTSD treatment for civilians. The clinical trials with civilians show at least 50% tend to get better. We don't have anything close to that in the comparable trials with veterans. So I think we could say that the system incentives to prove that they're sick and remain sick among veterans has a distorting effect on the science and what we understand about PTSD. A fourth point, the policies that we currently have are really tragically harmful to veterans and their families. We, in essence, are encouraging many veterans to assume a life of being psychiatric invalids rather than finding purpose and meaning and value in life. And some of the effects this has is it reduces their income overall. Is that fair to say? It provides a reduced sense of purpose in daily structured activity, which we know is counter-therapeutic, which we know is not the right recipe for happiness and well-being and quality of life. And we have the problem of encouraging veterans to incorporate PTSD and other psychiatric symptoms into their very identity. We send them the message that this is a lifelong disability that they now will suffer forever, rather than something that we can treat and help them manage and cope with. And my last point, number 5, is that it's tragic for our society as a whole. We have really spread far and wide the narrative, the myth of the dysfunctional veteran, but that's not the accurate. That doesn't represent military or veterans accurately. The idea that all veterans who served overseas are dysfunctional now. Also, as a society, we've removed many veterans from our workforce. We need them. They have a lot to offer. They have a lot of talent and a lot of skills and a lot of things to provide. We need that. And then I think we could even say it's a potential threat to national security if we are creating a widespread understanding in our society that military service is damaging and destructive to the individuals who serve. So I'm going to conclude now with 4 quick points that I'll offer as solutions, and the talks that come through for the rest of the day are going to address these in much more detail. So number one is we need to change the policy. We need to change the safety net. It would be good if we could make it easy, quick, flexible, and with the right incentives, and removing some of the disincentives that we have. We need to deliver evidence-based treatment for PTSD with the expectation for efficacy. And my good colleague right here, Deborah, is going to tell us how we can do that. We need to provide effective transition programs to the civilian workforce, and we're fortunate to have Lieutenant Commander Mike Sorelli here today to tell us about a program he's designed and developed and is taking forward. And then we need to, and this is aspirational, but we need to educate, engage, and mobilize our society. I think part of the tragedy here is most Americans don't know much about veterans. They don't know much about what happens in the military, and many of them view veterans as broken. And that's the dysfunctional myth. And they also view it as maybe a medical problem, but it's the VA's problem. It's not our problem as a society. It's something the VA is there to fix.
Oh, thank you. Excuse me. Thanks so much, Chris. And thanks for making it so clear that even though we're talking about work, we're not focusing on the notion of future taxpayers. We're talking about the idea of people attaining the most fulfilling lives possible. I mean, this is ultimately a human goal, not an economic one. So thanks for making that very clear. Deborah?
Thank you. So if we look at some of the figures and some of the information that Chris has given us, the real point that I'm going to try and make today is that we're spending a lot of money on resources, on people, but we're not really having much effectiveness. So the idea is, how can we turn treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder on its head? How can we do it differently in a way that might be rapid and effective and allow the resources that we need to use for people who have the disorder to do so efficiently and effectively? And if you really look at the numbers, the number that always sticks out to me is that 60% of the VA's budget during this time, and these were the most recent figures I could find, 60% of the VA's treatment budget is going to 28% of the people who are seeking services in the VA, those that have post-traumatic stress disorder and also traumatic brain injury. So we need to try and think about how do we best use those resources. And the difficulty with the current programs that we have, and we have some treatments that do seem to be somewhat effective or are effective in civilian populations, and maybe not so much in combat veterans. But the two most commonly talked about treatments are prolonged exposure therapy and cognitive processing therapy. And if you look at the literature, what it shows is that these treatments produce a statistically significant decrease in symptoms. So people have lower scores after treatment than they do before treatment. But one of the problems is that even after the course of treatment is over, between 50% and 66% still meet the diagnostic criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. So their symptoms have changed, but they're still meeting the diagnostic criteria. It's as if...
Deborah, can I ask you,
Sure.
This is not a clinical audience, so
Okay.
can you explain a little bit more what the exposure therapy, therapy?
I'm going to do
I'm
that.
so sorry.
Yeah, no,
Yes,
that's okay. Thank you. When we talk about exposure therapy, is if you were afraid of a dog, how would you get over your fear of a dog? Well, most people would say you have to be around a dog. So in therapy, what we have to do, and I'll speak a little bit more about it in a minute, we know that we have to somehow put you back in touch with the traumatic event. So let me hold it there for a moment, and then we can go back to it. But so the problem is that people are still sick. It's as if you dropped the fever from 104 to 101. You're feeling a little bit better, but you're still pretty sick. The other problem with the current treatments that we know is that there's a tremendous dropout rate, that between 25 to 40% of people never get the full length of treatment. And most people get 3 or 4 treatment sessions and then they drop out. An example that makes it pretty easy to understand is a friend of mine who started working at a new VA. The first day she was there, she got her schedule. She was booked out 3 months in advance with unique patients. So even if on that first day she saw someone that she thought had to be seen again, the next appointment was going to be 3 months away. It's a difficult problem to try and face and to treat people effectively if you can only see them 4 times a year. The summary has been that there's an ongoing crisis, as we know, in the treatment, that there's room for improvement in treatment effectiveness. We also have to talk about making these interventions available and making them be relevant so that people will want to participate. And in addition to the difficulty in getting appointments, there are some other barriers that have been examined as problems in people getting care. And one of those is just, as I said, the length of treatment, difficulty getting time off. When we think about medical conditions, you have a medical problem, you go to see a physician, you might be in an intensive treatment or intensive rehab for a period of time, and then you go back to work. In mental health, the common model is you see someone once a week or once a month for weeks or months or years, and you prolong the treatment in a way that makes it difficult for people who might be working to keep coming back. Another problem is really the perceived stigma, and we've talked about this a little bit, and people have talked about stigma a lot. What might be interesting to do in some of our work is that we have been trying to turn this on its head. And rather than thinking about this as a mental disorder, to think about post-traumatic stress as a psychological injury. And in thinking about it as a psychological injury, apply the same practice that we do with physical injuries to post-traumatic stress. There are things that we have used that are called intensive outpatient programs. They're primarily used for substance use, but there's been increasing interest in using them in an intensive fashion for psychiatric disorders or for things like post-traumatic stress. And what they do is, rather than coming for an appointment once a week or once a month, you sign up for a 3-week treatment program, you go every day, you get your treatment, and then you're finished. So Chris and I started treating veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder back in the mid-1990s. We were treating Vietnam veterans at that time. And what we realized was not only did we just need to do treatment, but we needed to gear treatment for what really is the multidimensional nature of this disorder. Veterans are asking for treatments that address anger, that address sleep disruption, that address depression, all of those things that really have to be included in a comprehensive treatment for what is really a multidimensional condition. And so we started an intervention, and the interesting thing that happened was, as we were starting to work with veterans from Vietnam, this was in the mid-1990s, the first question that we got was, "But doc, if I get too much better, I'm going to lose my disability. I haven't worked for 40 years. Who's going to hire me now? I'm 60. So we faced that challenge, and a couple of years later, we got a call from the Department of Defense asking us if they thought our treatment program would work for the younger generation, the OIF and OEF veterans. And my response was, I think so, because we're not facing 40 years of disability. So we put together a project, and what we did was to develop what really is an intensive outpatient program. So veterans and active duty personnel from over 20 states so far have come down to Orlando, Florida to participate in this research program. And what we have in this program are 3 components. The first is, as I was saying, exposure therapy. If you're afraid of a dog, you have to be around a dog. If the traumatic event was an IED explosion, that's not something I can set off at the campus. But we can do it with virtual reality. And so if we have to get you in touch with that event again, we can do that by using virtual reality. The idea is this is a learning process. And as you stay in touch with the sights, the sounds, the memory of that event will lose its ability to elicit arousal or distress in you. So we're not talking about erasing the memory, please. I would never suggest that memories can be erased. But what we're trying to do is disengage the emotion that is in contact with that memory. And if you think about it as when someone close to you has passed away. In the weeks afterwards, thinking about that person can create a lot of distress. After a period of time, you can think about that person without crying. That's the kind of thing that we're trying to do. But in addition to that, there has to be more that's done. So people with PTSD will say, I don't go to Walmart because it's too crowded there. I can't keep track of everything. People with post-traumatic stress disorder from combat often say, I can't sit with my back to the door because I can't see who's coming in and out. So another part of our 3-week program is doing what we call real-life exposure. We take them different places. The third part is the group treatment that we have, where we work on those skills that people talk about are the things they really want to learn. We run these closed cohorts, and I'll tell you what one colonel told me is he thinks what our secret sauce is that the groups form a squad. They become very cohesive. They live at the same hotel. They eat meals together. They come to therapy together. They help each other out when they've had a bad day. And they seem to be able to work together in a way that you don't find when you go to individual therapy and then you go to individual therapy a month later. The results, just to, we don't have to get into all the fancy details, but using the same scale that the Veterans Administration uses, a score of 50 on there means you have post-traumatic stress disorder. People come to our program significantly elevated, and after 3 weeks, the average score has dropped by about 50 points because of the intensive nature of this program. And it has held out. The military only funded us to do 6-month follow-up, but in 6-month follow-up, we still find that they're maintaining the treatment gains that they have. When we look at any measure that the VA uses as indicative of improvement, 66% no longer meet criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder after the 3-week program. And again, that's maintained at follow-up as well. If we look at changes in the CAP score compared to prolonged exposure or cognitive processing therapy, or we look at what's considered a clinically significant change according to the VA, again, we believe that doing this treatment in this intensive fashion would produce significant effects. We had 102 people in this program. We had 2 dropouts. Dropout rate is 2%, as opposed to 28 to 40%. Relapse rate after 6 months was 1%. The one person who had a relapse was assaulted and mugged, so again, had another traumatic event that brought back his symptoms. One of the big challenges to this is therapists are afraid to do the treatment in this fashion because they're afraid they'll produce psychosis or that people will drink a lot of alcohol because of the stress or become suicidal. We've been doing this program for 4 years and we've had none of those effects at all. Nothing like that has ever happened. So where do we go from here? Well, we're continuing to run the program. We're hoping that others will sort of pick up the idea that you can just flip the way that treatment is currently being done. And the other thing that we're hoping for and starting to look at is really the idea of a biomarker for post-traumatic stress disorder. Because a lot of the challenge is, do people really have a disorder or are they just faking the symptoms? You know, do they go on the internet and figure out what they have to say in order to have the diagnosis? We're working on some brain reactivity studies where we're exposing combat veterans with and without PTSD to smells of diesel fuel and also to sounds of explosions. And what we're finding is there is a different pattern of reactivity in the brain, that we see differences between people who have clinically diagnosed post-traumatic stress disorder and those who had the same experience but don't necessarily have post-traumatic stress disorder. It's not a diagnostic test yet, it's in the early stages. But again, I think thinking about how we can do these things differently may lead to some further progress and get people back to functioning.
Thank you, Deborah. Those results are really quite amazing. So just want to emphasize that, although those of you who followed this area probably can see that. Dr. Duggan?
Great. Sally, well, thank you so much for including me here today. It's really an honor to be here with you, with Chris, and with Deborah. I'm going to talk a bit. I'm an economist by training. I'm going to talk a bit about high-level data on the program and a little bit of research that I've done on the labor market effects of the program. Sally, what would be your ideal in terms of how much time I take?
10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay, 10 minutes. That's what we'll do. Okay, so the program, Chris and Deborah have already done a nice job, and Sally have already done a nice job talking about some of the important features of the program. It is disability compensation is the program that I'm talking about. There are certainly other programs that are administered by the VA. But it basically pays benefits to veterans with one or more service-connected disabilities. And like Social Security disability insurance, there is a medical screening process. Veterans can apply at a regional VA office, and they apply based on medical conditions, which could include hearing loss, PTSD. As Chris was noting, those are two of the big ones, but there are certainly many others as well. And a rating board determines if the condition A is service-connected, and if so, sets a rating for the condition. And then a combined disability rating is basically a function of, to the extent that you have more than one condition, it is a function of those. So if you had, let's say, a 30%, a 30%, and a 30%, your rating might work. It wouldn't actually, it's not just additive, it might work out to be 70% or so, but it is, and the applicant can appeal the decision for any condition, and in general, the combined disability rating moves from 10% to 100%, and the monthly benefit amount is increasing in that rating. And that's very different from Social Security disability insurance, where basically it's an all or nothing program. So you either qualify for Social Security disability or you don't. And also, one thing that one could argue is a potential virtue of the program is that, unlike SSDI, if you do have some earnings, it's not like they'll immediately toss you from the program. There are some exceptions for that. But you can just get a sense of how the benefits for this program work. Here I've just plotted out the benefits. This is the 2014 benefit schedule, monthly benefits for people with different combined disability ratings. And as you can see, they increase as you move to the right on this schedule. So a person who is married with one child who is 100% rating would receive $3,200 a month, but that same person with just a 10% rating would receive only about $170 a month. So there's a big variation in here. What is interesting, and what various research that I've done with David Otter and others indicates that the initial rating that a person has when they qualify for benefits is not necessarily what their rating will be a year, 2 years, or 5 years later. There's basically, typically, what you see is a person will get on with a rating of 10 or 20%, and that will tend to grow over time because maybe their conditions will get worse, or they'll develop new conditions, or what have you. But this benefit schedule is, and it is also true that some people with a rating of 70, 80, or 90% can get the full 100% benefit if they're deemed unemployable, unable to work. So you can, if you were earning only, let's say if you were at, I guess it doesn't work, but if you were at, let's say, 70 or 80%, you could move up to that $3,000 a month benefit. And here, I mean, part of the reason that I started studying this program, I had done a lot of research on Social Security disability insurance, and I learned about this program some years after starting to study that program. And what you see is that the fraction of veterans who receive benefits from and this is, this label over here to the right, percentage of Vietnam-era veterans, is wrong. This is the share of all veterans receiving benefits. And as you can see, from the mid-1980s until about 2000, it was hovering around 8 or 9%. And if we went all the way back to 1950, that would be true as well. So basically, it's been between 8 or 10% for 50 years, from 1950 to 2000. And over the last 15 years, that has more than doubled, from 9% to 19%. The 2016 data are not yet available, and that's partly been a function of changes in the medical eligibility criteria for the program. And so it is the case that those conditions have changed, and I've done a lot of work on Vietnam-era veterans, but similar growth has been apparent for more recent veterans too. Here you can see basically the share of Vietnam-era veterans receiving disability compensation was about 7.5% in 1986. It had risen to about 9% by 2001, and today it stands at 19%. And that's a really, really big change. And part of the reason that, as an economist, that I've studied this is to want to understand, well, what are the effects of this, not just on veterans, but also not just on, let's say, enrollment in the program, but also their overall economic well-being, their employment, and so forth. You can get a sense of this program. There are about 4.3 million veterans who are receiving benefits from the program. And here, this shows the age distribution, both of the stock of disability compensation recipients and of the flow. So I'm colorblind, so I don't know exactly which color, but I can tell which one's different. The one that's really high at, let's say, 67, 68 years old, that's the stock, whereas the one that's higher down, let's say, at ages like 25 or 26, that's the flow. That's the new people coming onto the program. And you can see, basically, the year of birth that has the highest number of people with disability compensation is 1948. Almost half of men born in 1948 are veterans. And so mechanically, you're going to have more disability compensation recipients then. But you can see that there's some difference between the stock and the flow. The new people coming onto the program tend to be your more recent veterans, but if you look at where's the bulk of the population, it is certainly the Vietnam era population is the largest group. One of the things, in addition to the growth in enrollment that has been especially striking to me, is that the ratings that people have has changed quite dramatically. So once again, if we look back to, let's say, the 1980s and early 1990s, by far the most common disability rating was 10 or 20%. That's the series up at the top that's basically flat. 1.2 million or so of disability compensation recipients had a rating of 10 or 20%. And next most common was 30 or 40% and so forth. And you can see this one with the diamonds that was not very common. That's 70+%. You can see only about 250,000, 270,000 or so, and then it has exploded so that it is now more than 1.4 million with a combined disability rating of 70% or more. So in addition to the fraction of veterans on the program more than doubling, the combined disability rating, the average combined disability rating has grown quite dramatically over this period. And because of this, the average monthly benefit for disability compensation recipients has gone up a lot. Whereas 15 years ago, Social Security disability insurance paid benefits that were about 30% higher on average than VA disability. Today, it is the case that VA disability benefits are paying more per month than Social Security disability. So you can see 1470, this is inflation adjusted, 1470 versus 900, that's an increase of about 60% over this period in real monthly inflation adjusted benefits. And so that partly because of that, expenditures on this program have grown quite dramatically over this time period. So in 1999, inflation adjusted, these are all in 2015 dollars, spending, this is just the cash benefits. This isn't getting to the data on treatment expenditures, which are also growing. You can see about $20 billion was spent on VA disability annually in 1999. And at that point, we had about 26 million veterans. Today, we have fewer veterans. We have 15% fewer veterans. So it was 27 million veterans, let's say, in 99, about 22 million today. So fewer veterans, and despite that, expenditures on this program in inflation-adjusted terms have tripled. So that is a really big change in a very short period of time. And I think, this has, as an economist, I've studied other big programs, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. What are their effects on the behavior of individuals and firms? I'm drawn to study, programs that are large and important, and this is one that that I've studied, and it's obviously it plays a very important role in our society, helping veterans who are. But as I think the point has been made before by Sally and others, and Chris, it's a program that's been on autopilot for more than 100 years, and it does seem like there might be some value in thinking about, are there reforms that we could make to this program to make it work better for veterans and also for America as a whole. So you can see part of the reason that as an economist that I've been interested in this is understanding what are the employment effects. And I'm also doing work on younger veterans, but let's say you look at men, and here for older veterans it's primarily men. If you look at labor force participation, for 20 years it was the case that near elderly men, if you were a veteran, you were just as likely to work as if you were a non-veteran, but that has changed quite dramatically over the last 10 years. And that is, Courtney Coyle and I and others have done some research indicating that the expansion of this program is a big driver of that. Also, younger elderly folks, same kind of deal. Veterans have moved in the opposite direction. And so we right now have a project where we're looking at Vietnam-era veterans born between 1944 and 1953. And if you look back around 2000, they were just as likely to be working in the labor force as their counterparts who had not served in the military. But over the last 15 years, as enrollment in this program has grown a lot, there has been a huge divergence. So that labor force participation among veterans in this age range today is about, so this is going down because this population is aging, are about 11 percentage points lower than non-veterans. And I think just, in the spirit of this idea of, there's a lot of interest right now in the country in increasing our economic growth rate, and there's two ways to do that: increase productivity or raise the labor force. And, as we think about reforms that we can do to programs, one possibility would be to think about reforming programs like this one to potentially keep more people working, and, in some respects, I think could raise quite significantly their economic well-being. So, yeah, so that's it. Yeah.
Thank you. Those are striking data. We have about, should we stop? What do you suggest? Okay, no, the congressman just came. Hi.
We'll come back to the...
Okay, Q&A. Okay, all right.
But I think you guys will stay put.
Okay.
We'll stay, yeah.
And, yeah. Hey, thanks so much. Congressman?
You gotta have an introduction. You can't speak without somebody.
So come here.
30 seconds.
Be careful.
You know.
Good to see you.
All right, so we're kind of winging it a little bit, but what the heck, it's going to be good. I'm back on stage to introduce Representative Mike Coffman, who currently is the chairman of the Personnel Subcommittee on the House Armed Services Committee, also serves in the Veterans Affairs Committee as well. Probably even more saliently, he's an infantryman, serving both in the Army and the Marine Corps in the course of his military career, and during which time I believe he was in one of the first units to enter Kuwait in the first Gulf War. As a member of Congress, he's paid as close attention to these issues as any member of Congress, both in the sense of ensuring veterans' equities, but also in pursuing the kinds of reforms that have been raised on the first panel. So I can't think of anybody better positioned to talk to this conference, to talk not only about the substance, but also about the politics of the issues, which are as important to reforming the policies as, in fact, the science is. So, Mr. Coffman, pleasure.
Thank you for that kind introduction, and Dr. Sattel, thank you so much for all your work on so many of these issues. I know we've had quite a few discussions on this. I was in the Army Marine Corps. I do go both ways. So my father was a career enlisted soldier, and I grew up in an Army family. And so one of the striking things I did growing up was that during the Vietnam War, the height of the Vietnam War, in 1969, I was 14 years old, and my father was wounded in combat in Army infantry in Korea, so he spent the remainder of his career in the Army Medical Corps. And so our last assignment was at Fitzsimmons Army Medical Center in Colorado, and it really became, I think, the center for amputees. Coming home from Vietnam, coming to the United States from Vietnam, to be stabilized there, and then they'd move on to the Veterans Administration for the rehabilitation. And so at 14, in 1969, I volunteered at the hospital, and morale was incredibly low for those soldiers. Unlike today, when we have much better prosthetics and we can actually return our wounded warriors back to active duty if they choose to do so. At that point in time, there really wasn't a choice given the technology of prosthetics. And so they were in the Army, but they really weren't in the Army because although they were soldiers, they weren't going to be returned to active duty, and so they were going to go to the VA. But the morale was incredibly low. Because of the fact that America's attitude towards our military at that time was at a very, very low ebb. In fact, through the 60s, latter 60s, probably through the entire 1970s, America's attitude towards the veteran community was very poor. I think in the 1980s it picked up, and today I believe it's probably the highest it's been at any point in American history. You have to go back to the Second World War to understand where Americans felt so strongly about their men and women who serve in the military and about caring for our nation's veterans. I was in the first Gulf War, the Iraq War, and it was really post first Gulf War that I began to see a rise of cases where claims were put forward with post-traumatic stress disorder. And then I came out of retirement to do one tour of duty in 2005, 2006 during the Iraq War, and during the Iraq War, claims for post-traumatic distress disorder really became epidemic. And so it is as the chairman of the military personnel subcommittee, as well as a member of the Veterans Committee, that's a real concern to me. From a couple standpoints. So first of all, from readiness, the fact that I don't think the selective service is a mechanism we're ever going to use. We didn't use it in the height of the Vietnam War and the Iraq War. But what the military used, particularly the United States Marine Corps, was its ability to go back into those Marines who had left active duty but had not yet been discharged. Today we have an 8-year commitment. So if you serve on active duty 4 years, then you have a 4-year remaining commitment where you are subject to recall. With the rising incidence of individuals putting forward disability claims, it really removes them from that reservoir of manpower, albeit men and women, that we can recall to active duty when necessary. And again, I think that I don't see us using the selective service system going forward if we needed them. One of the big problems with post-traumatic stress disorder that concerns me is that we have a different definition for the Department of Defense than we do for the Department of Veterans Affairs. And we had a hearing one day, a joint hearing, which is rare and it was, I think, Secretary Gates and Secretary Shinseki. And they were asked, and I think I asked them the question about how they define post-traumatic stress disorder. And it was interesting that there were two very different responses, and those responses really define where we are today. The Department of Defense said, we see it as a wound. The Department of Veterans Affairs said, we see it as a disability. Well, that has incredible ramifications, because in seeing it as a wound means subject to treatment. Disability means not subject to treatment. So now what we have is, if we look at the backlog of the extraordinary, I think we have 470,000 claims in the backlog, and that's just on the appeal side. In the Department of Veterans Affairs, many have PTSD. Some of them are multiple claims, but many have PTSD associated with them. There is, and Dr. Sattel has written about this extensively, but it is something that I think most people in your profession feel that it is treatable down to a level, using certain modalities of treatment, is treatable down to a level where it's no longer debilitating. And yet here we have something, in effect, what I see as a wound that is not being treated. There is no requirement for treatment. You merely go through the process of getting diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. You're awarded a percentage then of disability, but then you're not required treatment. And the unfortunate thing, when veterans do seek treatment from the Department of Veterans Affairs, and I'm in the middle of writing a request to the Government Accountability Office to do an investigation of VA's drug-centric modality of treatment, that I think is actually compounding the problem of our veterans because I've run across some cases. The Harder family in Colorado Springs. Several years ago, their son is a student. He's a Marine Corps Afghan veteran, veteran of the Afghan War. He goes into what they call a CBOC, or an outpatient clinic, from the Veterans Administration in the city of Colorado Springs, and he complains about symptoms related to post-traumatic stress. And he doesn't even see a physician. He sees a physician assistant who is able to write a prescription for a very powerful psychoactive drug or narcotic or drug to deal with the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. And of course, in the description of the drug, it says that you have to monitor. It requires significant monitoring for this drug. Well, he's not monitored. He's not even set to have another appointment, and he kills himself. I am investigating another case in Colorado where a veteran being treated for post-traumatic stress disorder at the middle of the night without clothes on, and a father of two, runs from his house without his clothes on in the middle of the winter at night, found 3 days later, who broke into somebody's garage for shelter and food and is arrested, and he's under an entire cocktail of drugs. Then it becomes a drug. It's a drug to stabilize them on their stress. Then it's a drug so they can go to sleep at night. Then it's a drug so that they can wake up in the morning. And pretty soon they're under this cocktail of these very powerful drugs, and bad things happen. And so, my certainly question to the GAO is to take a look at this drug-centric form of treatment. But one of the problems that we have, I think why the problem isn't seriously dealt with, is that we are unique compared to many other countries, in that we have a completely separate budget for the Department of Defense than we do for veterans. Separate budget, separate administration. So we have a rising number of drone operators who are now claiming post-traumatic stress and being discharged from the military. And so I remember meeting with the general who was in charge of the Air Force program for drone operators. Now, these drone operators never deploy outside the United States. There are two different categories. There's one category that takes them off and launches them and recovers them. They are in theater. But there's another, but they don't launch the weapon system. That's done by operators in the United States. Once they're aloft, the control reverts to operators actually in the United States who can look at the target, in a console, and can, in a Predator drone, certainly can then, deploy the weapon system. So, and I said to the general, well, tell me about what's going on here with the Air Force. And he said, well, it's hard when people are, doing this. They've just taken out somebody, and now they're going to go to the kids' soccer game, and it's just too stressful and stuff like that. And I was surprised that he wasn't concerned. And he wasn't concerned because, well, he should have been. I mean, he's going to have to now they're going to expend dollars in training out of DOD to get a replacement. But the fact is that disability payment comes out of the Department of Veterans Affairs. It doesn't come out of the Department of Defense. And if we look at, say, Britain, British soldiers, and try to correlate their service in Afghanistan and Iraq relative, you can't do it relative to our numbers, but statistically, their rates of post-traumatic stress disorder are very low. Well, Britain does what many other countries do. It's the same budget for Department of Defense as it is for VA. It's a combined budget. It's a unitary budget. So everything is a cost benefit to them. So they have an incentive to bring those soldiers back on active duty, than not simply to write them off and say, oh, that's okay. That's not my problem. It's somebody else's problem. So I'm very concerned. But I think that there is a growing, I think, influence in our culture that does disturb me. It's veteran as victim. It's veteran as victim. And it was said best by, I think, a pretty liberal member on my Department of Veterans Affairs Committee about a year ago. She said, I'm for veterans and against war. And so, so now there's the latest thought in all this is a new movement called moral injury. And it essentially states that anybody who participates in war is injured because of that war is an insult in and of itself on their moral values. I don't know how we ever prosecuted war as a country with that philosophy. And so so these are the challenges that we have, and I really appreciate the work of Dr. Sally Satel, who I had a number of meetings with, and how do we get down to, how do we change the system from treating PTSD not as a permanent disability, but as really a wound. And not to say that's going to work in all instances, but there are a lot of lives, I think, that are just being destroyed today. People not participating, not just in the military, but in society as a whole, based on the fact that that they're drawing disability and they don't have to work, and that's not healthy for them. And so we want them to be full participants in the military, certainly is my preference, but in society as a whole. And so we have to figure out to get down to the bottom of it, where we're treating people, we've got a treatment-centric approach that is not a drug-centric approach, and also that veterans are not victims. That it's about, the Army says it best, I think, when it's Army strong, it's resilience, when they try and preach resilience. And this philosophy is just completely counter to that. And so I want to thank you all for your interest in this issue, and from the standpoint of AEI for allowing me to come here today. Thank you so much.
Great. Congressman has time for a few questions. I actually wanted to recognize my colleague, Dr. Chris Free, because he had a little bit of advice, actually, for this study you'll be commissioning.
Well, I don't know about if it's advice, but it might be interesting to ask the VA to share their administrative data on treatment outcomes for PTSD. They've collected for at least the last 10 or 12 years regular data on PTSD symptom changes and outcomes in veterans. And I don't know of anybody that's outside the VA I don't know of anybody that's seen it. I don't think they've shared it. I don't think they've showed it.
Good. Thank you. Any questions?
Anyone else? Yes, please.
I'd just be interested to know. My question would be, even if you could, imagine a new set of therapies and regimens that would, as a matter of policy, achieve what you're asking for, how difficult it would be to change that political mindset you described among members, and obviously reflects a larger public opinion that prefers not to think about these things in many ways, and seems pretty happy at just throwing money at the current system.
Sure. So it's an enormous cost, but I would do it in two different parts. Now, first of all, from the standpoint of the active duty military, they are making tremendous advances on how to mitigate post-traumatic stress. I think in the, I remember talking to the Marine Corps, and when an infantry, they've taken a lot of lessons from law enforcement when there's a shooting to walk, in the aftermath, walk people through it, what they just experienced. In the Army, they have now paraprofessionals that are trained that I think are down as low as the battalion level to help people with post-traumatic stress. We've done better in terms of when people are coming back from deployments, having kind of a buffer zone, a buffer period from when they're reunited with their families. So that continually, I think that there is efforts being made on the active duty side to address this issue, and I think that they're fairly effective. Then on the veteran side, I think, quite frankly, I think the veteran service organizations, we've got to figure out how to work with them to encourage people into treatment that's productive. I think if you had a requirement for treatment at this point, conditional on receiving benefits, I think they would oppose that fairly, and I think that they would be in a blocking position to get something passed through the Congress. So it's a very challenging issue, I think, as a result of that. They see it as a right for the veterans.
Gentlemen?
What often doesn't get discussed is about 20 veterans commit suicide every day. And if you take that number back to, say, the start of war and terror, that's like 116,000 soldiers that we've lost, right? I mean, that's almost the size of Germany's standing military. When you factor in the cost of training a soldier, it's 100,000 per soldier. That's a staggering cost in many ways. Why don't we discuss that more? Why doesn't that come up almost on a daily basis? I mean, to me, a veteran committing suicide at the rate of an hour a day, I mean, that should be pretty big news.
I think there's a tremendous discussion going on how to mitigate that. I think that the new secretary of the VA is really working to establish an effective helpline that hasn't been working well in the past for veterans in need. It is hard when people leave the service to monitor their needs, but certainly one thing that we do know is the kind of treatment that I've just discussed, I think, is a contributing factor to suicide. This drug-centric approach. We had one case where a veteran, again, being prescribed this cocktail of fairly powerful drugs, relocated. And then his prescriptions ran out, and he wasn't able to navigate the bureaucracy of the system in his new location to get his prescriptions refilled, and it was so dramatic to his system that he ended up taking his life as well. So I do think that I worry because there's a legislation that I've put forward I think that the Army led this effort, and I disagree with it. And what the Army did was, when they needed to trim down their numbers, they historically, what they've done in what's called a reduction in force is that they give people early outs, but they still give them honorable discharges, or they if they don't feel that they're competitive, they don't allow them to enlist. So it's usually these first term enlistees that they want to weed out. And so what the Army had decided to do, really sometimes on the basis of minor infractions, put people out of the military, oftentimes who had fought in Iraq and Afghanistan, had trouble adjusting to garrison life after being in combat, then, with that other than honorable discharge, they didn't have any access to mental health services. And so what I'm trying to do is restore that now, and I think put forward legislation. The administration is probably restorative broader than certainly my request. And so I want to make it, but at their discretion, they could end it tomorrow. So I want to put that in law that says that these combat veterans who were given other than honorable discharges have access to mental health services. I think that will help as well.
Okay, one more, Doctor. This is Dr. Joel Cooper.
Joel Coopersmith from Georgetown University. You mentioned about combining the VA and DoD. Wherever you look, whatever you look at, the interface between VA and DoD needs work. It's maybe a little better in some areas, but certainly it's a long way from in education and health, every which way. Do you think there's a possibility of actually moving in that direction, or at least coming closer to it?
I think the reason why I gave that definition was because other countries have that structure, and that I think one reason why, I think that the Department of Defense would be more vigilant in terms of dealing with the issue. I think that they've made great progress, but if it was out of their budget, and they saw the direct consequences of it, but the fact that we have two separate budgets, one, and it's the VA that really that pays the disability claims, not out of their budget. It's not out of the DoD's budget. So there's no trade-offs involved. I think that's problematic. I don't want to combine the two. Actually, I'm moving in the opposite direction. I'm moving to separate them. And the reason why I'm moving to separate them, there's a movement afoot from the VA under the prior administration to have these to grow these joint facilities that would be VA practitioners on the healthcare side and military, serving military and their families. Part of that is simply because if you look at, this is an organization, the VA is an organization of a little over 360,000 people. That's well over half the size of the United States Army. That dwarfs the United States Marine Corps, the Navy, or the Air Force. Out of that 360,000, about 320,000 are involved only in the healthcare side. So I think that, and it's not the military is a merit-based system. The VA is a heavily unionized system, where it's very hard to get rid of somebody. And so it's, I don't want to mix those two cultures together. I want to keep them separate. We're trying to reform the VA culture right now and have legislation that's moved out of the House and is now in the Senate to reform the personnel system. But I just want to give you an example. I think Great Britain is an interesting example in looking at the British military.
Well, Congressman, thank you so much for coming. And I know we all hope that Secretary Shulkin will have some latitude, but that it is difficult. And I know you have to go, but what we're talking about on this panel and the next one especially is how, frankly, creative systems can work in parallel with the VA, because in some ways it probably is constrained. And I know you're doing all you can to break that constraint. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so we have 10 minutes for the Q&A that we didn't get to do. So I have a question, but if anyone else would like, oh, please go.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I believe, Christopher, you might be the person answering this question, because you did mention something about national security, I believe it was, at some part in your presentation. My name's Todd Wiggins. Good afternoon. So I wanted to ask you about moving forward, because it would be nice if we could think that this is something that happened in the past, and we're still dealing with the wars that we've already had. But the more I go on the internet, more time I spend on the internet, it gets the impression that things aren't getting any better, and there are more threats and there are more concerns around the world. So not only you thinking about what you have to do to help people that have been formerly in the military, but the people that are going to be in the future, what ideas do you have on how we can make it more attractive? Because obviously we may have to recruit young people again to fight. And also, secondly, what happens with our adversaries? I mean, they deal with the same problems that we do, right? They're human beings. So do we have anything to compare to as far as how we do business and help our veterans versus how our adversaries, and how does that affect us as far as future fights are concerned?
Wow, those are really good questions. I'll work backwards. I don't know about data on our adversaries. I don't know what we have there. I don't know how they handle it. My guess is that they handle it very, very differently than we do. And we've got some speakers on the next panel that might be able to say something to that effect. I don't know. I think the myth, the narrative, which I believe is a myth, and I think the data backs that up very easily, but the narrative that veterans are dysfunctional, I think, is very problematic. I think it's both unfair, but it's also harmful in terms of the message it sends. And I think there will be some discussion in the next panel about national security issues, perhaps, or part of the perspective that this might raise. Do you want to, I mean, is that, will there be any discussion about that?
I'm sure it'll come up.
Okay.
These are
Yeah,
gathered on the
I don't
front
know
line.
much. I don't have much opinion about it other than I know because it's politicized, and I know that about 12 years ago I was here in Washington and had lunch with a congressional chief of staff who pulled me aside and said, "Listen, your argument that the rate of PTSD is 8 or 9%, when some of us think it's more like 30 or 50%, she said to me, that's harmful to the anti-war effort." She was telling me that. And I was saying, well, listen, I'm not about the anti-war effort or the pro-war effort. I'm just saying what I think the data say. But I think there is an effort to interpret the data to show, to make the case. The congressman talked about the moral injury, and that is intended, I think, in part to dissuade people from supporting the military and supporting the effort that they're making.
Do you think the moral injury concept has morphed? Because I thought when Jonathan Shea, he's one of the first ones to come up with it, right? I thought what he meant was the moral injury was that people felt, profound, very complicated feelings, guilt,
We used to call it
whatever,
guilt.
about killing.
We used to call it guilt.
But it had to do with specific actions that were specific to the individual and how he or she interpreted them. And one could also feel a sense of betrayal by, one's commanding officers, that they didn't direct them properly, they made a bad call. But again, it was about a person's personal narrative, not a generic participation in war. But it's morphed. I really hadn't been aware of that. Oh, maybe that's
I don't.
Congressman's interpretation.
I maybe a different interpretation. I've got graduate students who are veterans, and one of them said to me, didn't have PTSD, but he said, every day of my deployment, he was deployed twice, he said, I woke up worrying and thinking to myself, is this the day I'm going to have to shoot a child?
Yeah.
It was that kind of thing, that a child would be wired and come walking toward them, and he would have to do something that everything, even though he knew had to do, was against everything he stood for.
Yeah.
But that was really the interpretation that I hear from the people that we work with.
So the creep, but there definitely is a
Some
creep,
creep.
and it's politicized, no question, and that creep has to do with the threshold for defining PTSD. Now, frankly, it's interpreted as pre-TSD, if you're afraid that you were going to have to do something. So the politics fits in, but as far as moral injury goes, I thought it had a somewhat different definition. Yes, sir, and then you.
Good afternoon. My name is Joel Wasserman. I'm a former intern here with Russia Studies. I volunteer with a couple of organizations over in Ukraine who deal with soldiers coming back from conflict in the eastern part of their country where Russia's invaded. And with Ukraine, you have an example of a country which has not had men coming home from war since the Soviet Union was in Afghanistan. They didn't deal with it great then, but what they have is essentially as blank a slate as you can get for an institutional infrastructure for taking care of people coming home from war. And I guess the question I wanted to ask was, with that blank slate, what are some ideas, some principles maybe, that you think would be best to take in designing this system of bringing men home from war, particularly from a civil society angle more than a government angle, because as you can imagine with Ukrainian government ain't so competent there. And again, if on that note, are there any countries who are handling things better than we are?
It's a great question, but it's really a question for the next. Can I call on you again for the next panel, Gary? No, great question. Unless, okay. So this gentleman?
Hey, good afternoon. Chris, you mentioned the increase of claims and claim conditions. Do we know what that is due to?
No. I mean, you can look at the casualties and the KIA rates across these different wars, and for American personnel in the last 15 years, the killed in action and wounded in action are much lower rates. But I think we've now part of it I think is good. We're encouraging veterans and we're encouraging military personnel when they separate to be mindful of physical injuries and psychological injuries and to seek treatment and help for them. So some of it's probably a good thing, increased understanding. But I think part of it is just societal. We see the exact same thing in the civilian sector, by the way, I think, that the rates of disability are going up in civilians. So what we see in veterans is not unique to veterans. It's a cultural shift that's enabled by a government.
But there have also been expansions in the set of conditions that are deemed eligible for disability compensation. So a good example is for Vietnam veterans who served in theater in Vietnam, Cambodia, or Laos, or in the surrounding waters, or flew over. If you have diabetes, then you are basically presumed, there's a presumption that is service-connected. And that led to that break in trend for Vietnam-era veterans. A lot of that was driven by the expansion of that condition. So there have been some changes in the medical eligibility criteria that basically mechanically are going to lead to people having more conditions than their counterparts with the same health status would have had 20 years ago.
What I used to hear from the World War II veterans I worked with when I was in the VA was they came home on a ship. When they got to the shore, they were told you can get in that line and wait several days and report all your health problems, or you can get in that line and go home right now. And they got in that line and they went home right now, most of them. I think military personnel today are given quite a bit more counseling and encouragement to document and note their health problems, which is a good thing in most ways.
Last question, sir, and we'll get you.
No one comes back from a combat zone, irrespective of branch or service or MOS or assignment, unaffected. I'm Ray Dubois from CSIS. I'm a Vietnam veteran. I served in the Central Highlands from 1968 to 69 with the 173rd Airborne and the 4th Infantry Division in the Special Task Force. I was very lucky, very fortunate. I returned without a physical wound. But as I remember, I didn't return without a psychological wound. And it doesn't make any difference, quite frankly, whether you hump an M60 through a rice paddy or you're flying a Charlie Charlie and you get shot at. You get shot at. You hear explosions. You get mortared. My question is, those statistics that you put up there are rather stunning. And Dr. Dugan just made a comment, maybe that tremendous increase in both individual veterans applying for disability and the dollars involved, part of it must be because of the added conditions that are allowed today for compensation. But what are the other causes? And I will even be so blunt and take the risk of saying that, in my view, and I've gone all over the country, I give speeches, I talk to veterans, I talk to active duty soldiers and Marines, especially those who've served in the land combat units. And I ask them, especially the veterans, whether they're officers, NCOs, or junior enlisted, what percentage of your cohort, age, service, and rank, who have gone to the VA, requested and received a disability rating, might be fraudulent? That elephant in the room. And again, anecdotal to be sure, not necessarily statistically legitimate, but it's interesting the results of my questions. NCOs say their fellow NCOs, 50%. Senior NCOs say it's even higher. We also know, and I think whether it was the congressman, Dr. Britz, the Israelis treat their soldiers with wounds, physical and psychological. They don't give them compensation. They treat the injury. They treat the wound. Society pays for that. How are we going to deal with that arguably less legitimate side? And I think Deborah talked about the veterans who say, if I say I'm fine, I lose my monthly stipend. I know this is a difficult issue. I've lived with it personally and with my friends, fellow veterans of all ages. This is something that I think we need to address.
Can I speak to that? I'd like to because you're right, and there is very good reason within data that's been collected within the VA to support that. I'll start with my own clinical experience. That 50% number sounds about right. There was a clinician survey that was done in the VA about 12 years ago, 15 years ago, found that many, I'm just searching through my stuff here trying to find it, but a high percentage of VA clinicians believe that it's 50%-ish. We did a study ourselves where we requested the actual military records of 100 consecutive patients and compared it to the military story, history that they told us. And we found a lot of discrepancies there. And these are published in the peer review. I can share them. There was another study done, a malingering study, that used a malingering scale and did this with a large number of veterans. Found that 25% were clearly responding honestly, 50% in the range of possible or likely malingering, and 25% clearly malingering. So, again, another large percentage. Mike McGrath, who used to be president of the Vietnam POW National Organization, he and I had some conversations about 15 years ago, and we tried to get the data from the then VA Secretary Principi. But his data extrapolated to the VA suggested that the VA had on their rolls 10,000 Vietnam POWs, repatriated POWs. But Mike could name every single one of them because he knew them all. He'd been there with them, and he could name them in alphabetical order, and there were less than, I forget the exact number, there were less than 800 that came back from Vietnam. So he was trying to get the then VA Secretary's attention to that issue. Got no traction. They wouldn't go there. The VA National Center for PTSD did a study that was published last year. They found that in a large national study of over 800 veterans who were already service-connected for PTSD disability through the VA, they did their own interviews with them and found that 30% of them didn't even meet criteria for PTSD. But here's the last point. The VA doesn't want to study this issue. They won't touch it. 20 years ago, there were a lot of studies published showing the use of the MMPI, a psychological survey instrument that has a validity index on it, and the average profiles suggested profound malingering. The VA essentially stopped using it. So this is an issue the VA won't touch, and the National Centers for PTSD, which are funded by Congress, won't touch this. They defend it heavily. I left the VA after publishing this study I described, about a year after it, because I got so much pushback from central office and from colleagues who were unhappy with this publishing this finding suggestive of PTSD. My then mentor at the time called me as we had our article submitted for publication. He said, "You can't publish this paper. It's too damaging. If this gets out, it threatens the VA's budget, and we can't have that." I published it anyway, and then I left the VA just because I couldn't do it anymore from inside. So I think it's a huge problem, and I think it leads to a huge misallocation of resources. Huge.
And no one can deny our fellow veterans who need help.
Absolutely not.
We have an obligation.
Absolutely.
But that issue of where the VSOs and the VA itself fear the pushback, if you will, to discuss this in an open, transparent, and honest way. We owe the money that the American taxpayers and the Congress appropriates for veterans' health care to those veterans who truly need it and suffer the wounds of war.
Yes, sir. Thank
Yes.
you.
Thank you. We'll
That's
end
right.
on that note then.
That's exactly right.
Oh, did you want to add something very quick?
Of the PTSD cases of people who are actually in combat and not just in the same area code where something bad happens. Do we have any data that reflects on that status?
I don't think not that I know of. The VA.
It's a 4-to-1 or a 5-to-1 ratio for those in combat to those that support, yet the numbers that you're describing are not indicative of those that actually participate in combat. It's people that are just in theater.
And the VA has explicitly made that a rule by fiat. They passed a rule a few years ago, and this gets into what the congressman was saying about the difference between DOD and VA, as well as everybody else, is the VA passed legislation saying the veterans don't need to produce any evidence of what happened. If they were in the zip code and that can be documented, that's all they look at.
I mean, Social Security disability periodically will check in on people to see if their conditions have improved and if they're able to return to work. And that system doesn't work perfectly, but you could imagine, I mean, at this point, if you look longitudinally at a person who's on the program and ask the question, if they're on with a 40 or 60% rating today, what's the chance 2 years from now they'll be on a lower rating or off the program? It's basically zero. So and I think that's just, but that's something that could be, it's hard to eliminate errors on the front end, but being able to, perhaps check in on people and see. I mean, private disability insurers certainly do that with their enrollees, partly so that they can help their enrollees get to a better place, both health-wise and economically.
So we're going to move on to the second panel now. Thank you, where we'll talk about some solutions to all the problems that have been painfully laid out.
Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Wait for a couple folks to return from the hallway and places slightly beyond. We'll wait for Sally to sit. So, it's the least I can do is embarrass her. Yeah. Well, welcome back. I'm Gary Schmidt. I'm a resident scholar here at the American Enterprise Institute, and as my colleague Tom Donnelly noted, we co-direct the Security Center here at AEI. But I also am the director of another program at AEI on what we call the Program on American Citizenship, which in various ways actually doesn't capture exactly what we do, but one of the things we have done over the last few years is worried about civic culture, and as a key component of that, we've spent a good deal of time thinking about the larger public's relationship with the military and the all-volunteer force, and of course, veterans. So again, I'd like to join Tom in thanking Sally for not helping, but putting this together and letting us join in. So this panel is the happy panel. That's what we're going to do is talk about. So he's not very comfortable being happy, but anyways, we're going to focus on workforce reentry issues and some very novel programs and positive programs intended to assist veterans with reentering the workforce and civilian life. I'm going to go in reverse order of their speaking, so let me briefly introduce our panelists. Speaking last will be Michael Sorelli, who's a 19-year veteran, former Marine, Navy SEAL. Michael is finishing up his MBA at the University of Texas in Austin, and he's tries to keep the fact that he's also a Texas Aggie away from other people knowing that. Is the founder of Vetted, which is a very exciting new veteran service organization, which Michael is going to talk to us about. Speaking second is Thomas Meyer. Tom is the program director at the Philanthropy Roundtable for Veteran Services, and he's the co-founder of the Independence Project.
So I am the founder of Vetted. This is a initiative started in Texas, backed by Chancellor John Sharp of Texas A&M, Chancellor William McRaven, who you probably know as Admiral William McRaven, as well as Rice University, Wharton, and the state of Texas. We truly believe, having seen the talent in the military, that we can, as Dr. referred to as, raising the economic performance of the American private sector. We just have to cultivate the talent coming out of the military, give them the confidence to succeed in the private sector. And then we also act as a talent pool for corporations to come to get these amazing veterans coming out of the military. And lastly, there is so much information out there. Vetted is trying to simplify the transition process. I think the last I checked, there's roughly 50,000 veteran service organizations, and that is just cumbersome for veterans stepping out of the military to sort of wade through that information and simplify the process for him or her. So McCombs School of Business at UT and the Mays Business School conducted a lot of research when we started looking at the problems facing our veterans. If you're not familiar with the statistics, 70% of veterans struggle with the transition and finding employment within 12 months. On the flip side, 70% of HR managers admit that they have trouble translating how skills in the military refer or relate to the private sector. Also, veteran entrepreneurship is at 4%. That is down 45% since World War II. And then, as the gentleman referred to earlier, statistically, around 3 veterans will have killed themselves by the end of this symposium, and the homeless rates amongst our veterans are climbing as well. And it's just not the veterans getting out at the 4-year mark. Even our top veterans, service academy graduates, are suffering and facing the systemic challenges during the transition. What we boiled it down to, based off the research we conducted, as well as the Center for New American Security, is the top 3 challenges they face are, 1, the skills translation. And I think this just points to the great divide that we discussed at dinner last night between the new civilian sector and our very, very small veteran population. It's not ignorance, it's just you don't know what you don't know. And if you haven't served, it's very hard to conceptualize what we do in the military. The second is the perception of lack of hard skills amongst veterans. And I will tell you, the private sector is not totally wrong here. We are actually very honest with veterans. We are sort of a no-thrills organization, that you don't leave the military with these built-in private sector skills. We didn't do finance, we didn't do accounting, we didn't do operations or marketing, and we were stewards of money. We weren't makers of money, and that is a very difficult sort of paradigm shift to navigate. We actually give a financial intelligence test to a lot of the veterans that reach out to us, and the scores are low. And the only thing we do with that is, 1, to humble them, that, hey, you need to learn a new skill, and it's okay. The skills we employed as military veterans were very unique. It was an art, and that's what made us successful. But there are a lot of soft skills that come out of the military that the private sector absolutely wants and can't cultivate amongst their civilian coworkers. Leadership development is a serious issue within the corporate world, and they're still sort of trying to figure out what the right solution is to cultivate leaders within their organizations. And then third is the mental stigma, and I'll be honest, we think, 1, veterans have been overwhelmingly stereotyped into this broken warrior type mentality. And I think the narrative for the nation needs to change. Our own Secretary of Defense, Mattis, a few years ago, while was quoted as saying, while he doesn't refute PTSD, he believes in post-traumatic growth. That war makes us better fathers, mothers, brothers and sisters, more empathetic to man. And we need to focus on that narrative and remind veterans who they are and the amazing resiliency that they learned in the military, and the capability they have to affect the future and get engaged with society. So this is just one anecdote I like to show to sort of capture that divide, is the disconnect between veterans and the private sector. So interviewed a executive with an Austin-based consulting firm, and they had a veteran hiring initiative to hire 35 vets in 1 year. They were 34 short at the end of that year. And I like to say I pulled the BS card on that one and dug a little deeper. They said they just couldn't translate the resumes. And we had a great conversation, and I sort of questioned the legitimacy of their veteran hiring initiative, if that's the results that they produced. The other is a Navy lieutenant commander who was a subject matter expert, an intelligence analyst on Iran and the Arabian Peninsula. And it took him 1 year to find employment in Texas. Guy is brilliant, but he admit he had trouble translating his skills and how it affected the bottom line of the company he was interviewing with. So looking at the current transition solutions, of course we have the DoD Transition Assistance Programs, what we call TAPS. It's directed towards the mass transitioning population. So you could have Private Sorelli sitting next to Colonel Campbell, and we're receiving the same transition platform, which arguably we're going for very different jobs. Entry level, vice, hopefully a mid-level manager position towards an executive position. And I don't blame DoD, and none of us do. DoD is in the unique business of creating leaders and warriors, and a 2-week program is just not going to fit the bill. When you think about it, it took me about 1.5 to 2 years of training to learn how to do my job in the military. So it's a far cry from the 2 weeks that prepare me to enter the civilian sector. Others are these VSOs that run these 1 to 3 week programs, which I've been through a few of them. Well intended, but at the end of the day, too short and too broad in scope to leave the veterans with any tangible, marketable hard skills. And then, of course, the military headhunting firms that do a little resume translation do some interview prep with the veterans, and then charge a headhunting fee as they find them jobs. The thing with the military headhunting firms is they focus mainly on JMOs, what we call junior military officers, the O3s, and they turn away a lot of the other veterans, which is the bulk of the veterans coming out, because they're not profitable. Now, if this slide is both confusing and gives you a headache, I've sort of achieved my desired effect. So this is from a base transition office, and this is actually only 2/3 of the flow diagram. I couldn't fit the entire thing on a PowerPoint slide. I want to identify the base, but this is ridiculous. And again, it goes back to my point about there's so much information out there that we need to simplify the process. Now, if you see in the upper left-hand corner, it says 18 to 24 months. So think if you handed this to a specialist in the Army, the overwhelming feeling he would get, it's almost, you'd want to give up right there. And what you're telling that specialist is he needs to start prepping his transition 2 years into his 4-year enlistment. I think we need to allow our veterans to focus on the jobs that they have overseas, of bringing their men and women home as well as themselves, and let us deal with the transition and let them know that we have their backs on the back end. Because this doesn't sort of convey that message. I'm still trying to figure it out, by the way. So why vetted? We are transforming proven military leaders into tomorrow's industry leaders and entrepreneurs by giving them the hard skills they lack. And like I said, we are trying to simplify the process. Our vision is really to create the first state platform in Texas, prove the hypothesis, the model, and then spread from there. We were already speaking with the state of Virginia Department of Veteran Services, who found out about us and want us to scale our programs to their state as well. And we create that talent pool. We create that best-in-class education for the scope of all our veterans, and we also want to reverse that downtrend in entrepreneurship. The process is 5 phases. Starts with the transition. Oh, sorry. Thank you. Is a 5-phase process starting with the transition preparation. The way I like to sort of analogize this is when you're done with your military career, whether it be 4 years or 20 years or 37, is you feel like you're 18 again, trying to figure out where your next passion is, and that's where we help in the first phase. Then we provide the education through a series of distance education and residence education, and then finally with career placement or veteran startup assistance. The key phase to all this is really the follow-through, is staying in touch with the veterans, let them know that they have a support network, how they're succeeding within their sector, if they need to make an industry shift, and then, of course, collecting that data to improve the programs along the way. Give you a snapshot of the Veteran Accelerated Management Program, which focuses on E7s and above. There's very few programs for our senior enlisted. There's a lot for the E6s and below, but this is why we decided to start with the Veteran Accelerated Management Program. We are seeking VA certifications for this course. 1, for the sustainability and scalability across the nation. 2, because veterans need to have skin in the game. They need to learn very early on that nothing in the private sector is for free. And this is part of the expectation management that we deal with veterans. It's an approach of tough love. And these are problems that need to be dealt with by veteran hands. So after they're accepted into the program, they go through 5 months of distance education through Wharton. They hit all the business verticals from marketing, accounting, finance, operations, and it ends in a capstone. They also begin mentorship paired with business leaders through either American Corporate Partners or Veterati, which are 2 mentorship platforms specifically for veterans. And that is key. That is that one-on-one touch to work through whatever issues they may have, questions they may have, to identify what industry is right for them. Then they come in for 2 months of residence education. Right now the programs that we have are Texas A&M, UT, and Rice. These are at their business or their MBA schools. And they really get a MBA-style education within those 2 months. Monday through Wednesday in the classroom, and then Thursday through Friday, they're either part of a micro-consulting capstone project embedded in a company, solving some corporate problem, or they're working on their entrepreneurial capstone which really assists with starting their own businesses. They will also receive more career services than an MBA student receives in his 2 years. So we're talking anywhere from 20 to 25 hours. Of course, LinkedIn, resume optimization, a lot of mock interviews, compensation and salary negotiation, something we've arguably never had to deal with, and we prepare them for that job search. Future programs are the Veteran Business Foundations Program, which is for E6s and below, mirrors the Veteran Accelerated Management Program. It's shorter in length, roughly 5 months, 3 months distance education, and 2 months at universities. Right now, this is being developed by Texas A&M San Antonio, Texas A&M Central Texas, which are located outside of Fort Hood and Joint Base San Antonio, and soon UTSA and University of Texas El Paso will get involved. Really, the 3 outcomes of that one is to show or to instill the confidence within our young veterans that they have the ability to succeed in that academic environment. The military is very progressive. 34% of all college students are the first in their family to attend college. 64% of veterans on the GI Bill are the first ones in their family to attend college. So, the military does a lot of good in terms of progressing society. We will also, if they decide not to go into the academic environment, place them in industry or assist with their startups as well. And then the industry-specific education is in partnership with organizations like Galvanize, General Assembly for IT-specific vocations, cybersecurity, web development, user design, digital marketing, things along those lines. Lastly, I end with this to end on a positive note. This isn't to say, hey, this is veterans versus civilians, but just to show the value of veterans, sort of the validation in industry. Former military CEOs within the S&P 500 outperform their counterparts in the S&P 500. Their tenure in the leadership positions is longer than their civilian counterparts. They statistically make more ethical decisions, and their leadership results in healthier cultures and stronger corporate performance. So the value is there. We just need to remind veterans that they have this possibility. They can have this outcome. They just need to put the work forward. A lot of it, at the end of the day, is expectation management and tough love with the veterans that we put through our programs. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. I wish I'd known about the stock performance about 20 years ago. But anyway, Tom, up to you.
Can I attend your program? Can I go?
I will be sitting right next to you.
So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Independence Project. We start from the point of thinking about what provides sort of the best life. I know that's something that AEI thinks a lot about. And our answer essentially comes down to 2 things: health and purpose. Something to do with your day, something to structure your time, something to know that you add value. And as we heard earlier today from all those very smart people with many, many degrees, the current system is, for a lot of folks, leaving them behind when it comes to health, when it comes to sort of economic performance. And I also want to highlight something that Mark brought up, which is that our country is in deep trouble if this very high quality human capital is not re-engaged. Our economic growth and our workforce participation are not in a good place right now, and a lot of that has to do with sort of society-wide trends, but veterans are and can be a real solution to that if we kind of make sure that we get the incentives right. So I won't sort of belabor any of the points earlier. I'll assume everybody was tracking along those lines. And I'll say that me and my co-founder, a guy named Daniel Gade, who's a recently retired Army officer and West Point instructor, looked at veterans in transition, veterans with disabilities, and sort of identified 2 sources of problem that kind of put them in the situation that the folks earlier described. One is an identity problem, and 2 is an incentive problem. So if you think about military transition, if you're getting out of the military, you're not going through one transition, you're going through dozens of them, right? You're changing careers, you're changing income streams, you're changing communities, geographies, family situation, housing, I could go on and on. but you're having a lot of change at once. And what is particularly up in the air is your identity. Someone says, okay, you're no longer a soldier, you're no longer an airman. What are you? And part of the education that comes with the way that the military transitions you is education on what your benefits are. And while that's a good thing, we want people to understand what it is that they qualify for. This education also instills some identity, right? So take away soldier identity. Here's your disability application form. Here's your unemployment compensation form. And it can set a really terrible expectation. So that's on the one hand, is that the veterans in transition are put in this really difficult place when it comes to finding new identity. The second piece is incentives. We currently have a benefit system that is very large for veterans, but some of the benefits are at loggerheads, right? We want people to get better, we want people to get healthy, we want people to experience less disability in their lives, we want them to experience more ability to do the things they want. But we also have this incentive system that pushes back against it and says, well, if you want financial stability in this time of transition where you're experiencing a lot of change, you should keep that rating, and getting better might cost you. And so there's this push and pull in two different directions that's really not good for transitioning veterans with disabilities. So my co-founder and I kind of took a step back from this and talked to actually a lot of the smart people who were on the panels before us and asked, okay, if we're looking at this disability system and we're saying that we want to produce maximum health and productivity and quality of life, and if we were to design it today, sort of blank slate, what would that look like? What would it look like to take into account all of the huge advances that have been made in the last few decades of rights for people with disabilities, things like the Americans with Disabilities Act? What would it look like if we incorporated different learnings about the way social programs have helped millions of Americans come out of poverty and get back into the workforce? What would a disability system look like if it were designed looking at some of the updates and improvements that disability systems in other countries like many in Northern Europe and that other of our peer militaries have made to their disability systems? And so what we came up with in the end is what we call the Independence Project. It's a program that bundles a number of different supports together to support veterans who are really at the point of transition from the military to achieve these two things: better health and, in sort of concrete terms, higher earnings and more employment. The interventions that we've come to include in this, based on all this research and learning from what other folks are doing, as well as talking to some of the really wonderful veteran nonprofits who are working in this space, are things like career coaching. I mean, you heard Mike talk about it a little bit earlier. Long-term career coaching to help somebody find what their purpose is and find what really means meaningful work. That's important. We probably need that. Things like flexible training and equipment funding. If you need to go and get that dream job in Seattle, but you don't have the money for a plane ticket to go do your interview, you're not going to get the job. So something that's flexible, that's able to help somebody just remove barriers, right? This is something that has been tried in a number of vocational rehabilitation programs for civilians with disabilities. And we think one of the other interventions, like something we're particularly excited about, like an earnings bonus. So instead of having an incentive that says, hey, watch out, don't get better, because if you do, then this income you've come to rely on is going to go down. What if we had a reward system that said, hey, we want you to be as successful as you can in the civilian economy. Why don't we have you rewarded as a percentage of your income for achieving. So something similar to the earned income tax credit, where you, up to a certain point, you earn a bigger bonus the more you earn. So we're packaging these together in different combinations and really trying to catch veterans early and set them on paths that can really change their lives. We're taking folks who have initial disability ratings and not asking them to get off of them, but seeing if we can help them put together the means they need to really thrive outside of a military environment. In very early stages right now of an implementation pilot, but we're working with a wonderful nonprofit organization named Hire Heroes USA, and a great program director down there in charge of it, an Army veteran named Ross Dickman. So we're really excited about where this can go, and really excited about sort of what it means to ask the question of what a disability system can be for if we sort of put health and economic success at the center of it.
Thanks, Tom. I'm going to be a moderator and actually turn the floor over to your questions. But before we do that, on the previous panel, Chris Free has a few comments. Fill us a little bit more in on Morgan's program on Reboot. So if you pay attention to Chris right now, so if we can get him a mic. I think it was on.
Oh, was it? Oh, yeah. Sorry. Yeah, thank you. I'm a little sorry that the video that got shown was not the video as I was expecting. Morgan Luttrell had a nice video that was played at the Navy SEAL Foundation conference last November. When he wasn't able to make it today, I said, "Can you send us that video?" So we didn't see what I was expecting, but I can say a little bit more about his program because it's similar to what I and some others are trying to stand up in Houston, and Mike is a part of this as well. I think there's a number of people realizing that the problem that many veterans face is not just PTSD. It's not just ringing in the ears. It's a constellation of difficulties and challenges and injuries that kind of come together from many, many years of being around explosions, including training, not just combat. The kind of weaponry that our military uses and trains with, and things like jumping out of helicopters, jumping out of airplanes. That what we often now see is a syndrome that includes maybe some PTSD or anxiety, but certainly brain injury, sleep cycle disruptions, endocrine disruption, immune functioning disruption, chronic pain, orthopedic issues at every joint in the body, headaches, chronic headaches is very common. We tend not to treat these things holistically, and we tend not to include the families in this. So what we're trying to do is create a program where we have operators or veterans or military personnel active duty come for a week or 2 or 3 in an intensive outpatient kind of program. And part of what Dr. Bidell was describing could be part of that, but it would also include a holistic approach that would look at the endocrine labs. I mean, one of the first things that I do when I talk to somebody is I ask them, what is your testosterone? What's your thyroid? What's your vitamin D look like? And most people, nobody's ever checked that. Well, guess what? If you have low testosterone, you're not sleeping well, you're irritable, you're depressed, you have very low energy. Sometimes it's a matter of getting the right type of supplementation in there to help people. What are we doing for brain injury? We saw just a very little bit of it in Morgan's video where he was doing TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation, using electromagnetic stimulation on the brain. He also was doing some direct current electromagnetic stimulation, and those are kind of things that he's using in his research. I think there's a lot more room for us to be doing a whole lot more with those. VA doesn't do much with those kinds of interventions. Very rare for veterans going into the VA to get their endocrine labs or their immune functioning labs run on a routine basis. It tends not to be something that they do in a mental health clinic, and they should. They always should. So we're trying to develop programs where we can get veterans in for 2 to 3 weeks, have them in a residential, put them up in a hotel. In Houston, the Methodist hospital system has a Marriott that's physically attached to it. We've got rooms blocked out there. They walk across a skyway into the hospital, and they can stay with us for a while, and we can treat them holistically, everything they need. We develop treatment plans that we start, and we can then send them home to their home communities, wherever that may be in the country, with the treatment plan, and then use things like video conferencing to stay in touch with them, to either provide care or coordinate care. We need to identify places, pockets of communities where veterans are living geographically, where we can develop satellite programs, and we've actually started that. We've got some conversations going between folks in Houston and Virginia Beach, for example. Yeah.
Thanks, Chris. Questions? Tom, please wait. Identify yourself and.
My name is Gary Schmidt. No.
You're the other bald guy.
Yes.
Excuse me.
Oh, sorry. Do you want to help on the center too?
Yeah, you're not even the other bald guy on the podium. All right, simply to continue. It seems to me that one of the challenges to reform is to be able to document and demonstrate a comparative difference and successes of the kind of approach that both of you guys are describing vis-a-vis the current system. I'd be interested to know if you're aware of any studies, or even anybody who's the first panel too, if work is being done in that regard, and what kind of measures are you looking toward to again, that would make a contrast with the kinds of outcomes that we're getting from the current system?
Right. So I wasn't explicit about it earlier, but attached to this program implementation, we're looking at running a full sort of randomized trial to bring folks in and give as many of them as we can afford these different supports in different combinations, and then for a number of other folks, sort of see how they do who are in similar situations over an extended period of time, and really, see if we can drive up earnings, if we can drive up employment rates, if we can drive up sort of self-reported quality of life. I think that it sort of intuitively makes sense that if you can, if you have supports and incentives all pushing in the same direction towards, healthier reintegration, then it'll work. But without actually tracking the information and asking it in a very rigorous way, there's no proof of it. So.
Well, I think both our programs are in their infancy, and we're going to wait for the data analytics that come back. And I think Thomas, with the Independence Project and our project, are going down the same path. Ultimately, what we'd like to see as secondary and sort of tertiary effects out of our program is that the PTSD rates amongst our vetted fellows decreases as they become more engaged in community and society. And basically, it goes along the give a man a fish, feed him for a day, teach him how to fish, feed him for a lifetime, is give these guys the skills they need to actually succeed in the second chapter of their lives in the private sector. It's one thing to get a veteran a job. It's another thing to give them the tools to succeed. And that's what both our organizations are striving to do. I do want to take the opportunity, the gentleman's question earlier for the first panel. We actually had a dinner last night, and we were talking, and one of the things I said is, I have a son and a daughter, is what is the message we are sending to our youth, who are our future our greatest generations, that we will require to serve in some capacity? when they see the veterans come home and flail during the transition. I think my son has the bug. He wants to be a Marine. And I'm going to have to sit him down when he makes that decision to enlist or to take a commission and say, hey, wait, you're going to be at a disadvantage given today's state of the veteran transition compared to your civilian counterparts if you join the military and serve. Because that's what he sees. So, I would see our rates of young, our youth wanting to serve lower if this sort of continues on. I mean, every generation will answer the call. If we have another 9/11, I have no doubt that this generation would answer the call, but it just sends a very bad message to our youth. Thanks.
You know, it's a conversation I've had with my son, and he never wanted to be in a think tank. I don't know. So, but Mike, I did want to ask, so it looks like to me from your presentation, I mean, like it looks as though the business schools, I mean, it's Texas, but they're kind of leaning forward in the program. Is that because they see something in veterans in business that they sort of think, well, this is, untapped, a resource, or are they just being good citizens? I mean, what's the combination here?
I think it's a combination of both. One, it's the right thing to do. They do see a superior performance in the veterans that go through their MBA programs, and they do consider it an untapped resource. And if they can really just give the tools for these guys to succeed, they're going to do it. The reason we tried, or we didn't try to replicate an education program or an executive education program, is because the domain expertise already exists in the schools. So basically, Vetted becomes a middleman between the veterans and the universities running these programs. And we intend by 2019 to hopefully spread to Darden, UNC, Duke, and scale these programs to where the troops are mainly located, and really up those employment rates coming out. And then hopefully we'll get the statistics to prove that compared to veterans that don't go through the program, they have a higher quality of life.
Please, right up here.
Hi, my name is Todd Bowers. Quick question. Veteran service organizations tend to be the advocates for big changes and things along those lines. Disability has traditionally been sort of the backbone of their business model, for lack of better terms. How do you get them to sort of change that narrative around making transition more effective and having disability compensation kind of flip around and become a little more effective when it comes to being a transition tool, when historically it's been kind of even their funding backgrounds?
Well, I think it comes from a deep sort of desire and just sort of trained from an early time, kind of obligation to help your fellow veteran, right? And so I think that's really what drives, I think, everybody who works in sort of the veteran serving space. And so asking the question of how can, I think Chris said earlier, this is about a 100-year-old program, asking the question of how can we make this relevant for today? How can we make this sort of a launching pad to success? Is a question that everybody wants to answer. So it's not about, taking benefits away from anyone or, shifting money into out of veteran stuff. It's about saying, okay, how can we invest this in the same people and really help them launch into careers where they're just stratospheric success?
In the back here, please.
I wonder, a lot of analogies are made between veterans after World War II and veterans now. I wonder if that analogy is really valid, because now the military tries to, we have an all-volunteer force, and the military is inculcating that all-volunteer force that they are a profession. And perhaps there are more analogies to other professions where the careers end early. Policemen, athletes, dancers. And they're in a profession, and they have certain skills. Generally, the most prominent skill is discipline. You take any of those military, policemen, athletes, discipline is the most, and many of them do very well in life, even in fields, you take dancers, for example, and I don't know if that's a good analogy, but they do all kinds of things when you wouldn't think they would after they finish. So I think maybe there's more to learn from career transitions and other fields like that, rather than looking back at World War II where everybody served, it was what you did for your country and that's it. Or looking at a country like Israel, somebody mentioned, where everybody serves, and the social services they get afterwards are not directed at the military because everybody serves, it's the same ones everybody else gets.
Very interesting perspective. And we've actually looked at athletes, they struggle during their transition actually finding employment because they're very typecasted as well. The one thing that's sort of the uncomfortable discussion is in the room is my family has pretty much served from World War II on. And just the image that my grandfathers gave me, they never talked about the war until I joined, and then I probably heard the same story 12 times, but I sat there and I listened as if it was the first, is our era of veterans have noticed amongst our population is that there is a bit of a sense of entitlement, and it's holding us back, and this is horrible. So we have to remind our brothers and sisters in arms that it was an all-volunteer force, that nobody held a gun to our heads when we signed that bottom line. We did it for very altruistic reasons, the right reasons, because we felt the sense of duty. But for whatever reason, we're seeing a large sense of entitlement from the veterans getting out. And as a veteran, be a quiet professional. Show people that you're a veteran through your actions, not through declaring some semblance of respect and wearing it like a badge. And this is honestly a discussion that needs to be led by veterans and policed up by veterans, because it can't be done by the civilian sector. These are, again, are veteran problems that need to be led and solved by veteran hands.
Could I also answer that?
Yeah, sure.
Thanks. Joel, that's a really good point. One of the things populations we looked at in sort of designing our program was actually dislocated workers, right? Folks whose were factory workers in Ohio, factory left. Now they're the job for which they're trained, that they identify as, that they have been doing for years, they can't do anywhere else. And so I think you're exactly right about that. And the reason I bring up that sort of example in specific that applies to so many people is that one of the, I think, amazing things about veterans as a population to sort of focus on is that these are really high quality people, and if we can get it right for them in lots of different ways, right? If we can get healthcare right for them, if we can get workforce participation and higher education right for them, a lot of those lessons can be exported to the rest of American society in different ways, and that's really beneficial to everyone. So I think that's a really important point that you bring up. And related to your point about sort of discussing these really tricky issues, I think it's one of the really dangerous things is, although I agree with you that veterans need to step up and talk about this. A lot of them already are, not just this issue, but a lot of others. I think it's important for civilians to not feel that they can't talk about it. I come from a military family. I grew up sort of in and around bases, and yet I didn't serve. But I think it's really important that civilians also engage in this conversation, because otherwise we're just sort of widening this gap.
Yep, please.
At the beginning of the conference...
Can you identify yourself, please?
Yeah, John Soliday, economist. At the beginning of the conference, Dr. Sattel made a point that income maintenance is not the problem, it's reintegration. And playing my economic mind game on it is, what are the financial disincentives, marginal tax rates that veterans face from employment or losing? What's the marginal tax rate from losing a disability classification?
So,
Just a quick.
so I'm a political scientist. I know nothing about.
Right now, there are about 4.3 million veterans getting disability compensation. Probably about 500,000 of them qualify for what's called individual unemployability, which is basically they had a relatively high rating, not 100%, but they're deemed unable to work, and so they get the 100% benefit. So if you would be receiving a benefit of $1,500 a month and you're getting $3,200 a month, that's a $20,000 a year increase. That's a potentially big marginal tax rate. So if you're going from a 70% rating to the full 100%, that's about almost a $20,000 a year increase. So I think for those folks, there's a huge marginal tax rate potentially for working. Also, even among people who are not getting individual unemployability, there's the possibility that they may get it in the future. So if you work today, you may damage your case for getting getting the enhanced benefits in the future. So I think it's pretty hard to, for the most part, for most people getting disability compensation, you can just think of it as a cash transfer, but incentive effects are important for an increasing number of veterans, and I think that, it is, it's a challenge because, I think one of the biggest challenges economically the country faces is this very low labor force participation rate. It's lower now than it's been since 1978, and this is yet another thing that is, reducing the incentive to participate in the workforce.
Final comment, question, Sally? Wait for the mic.
No. I'm sure, just to clarify about the income maintenance, certainly no objection to it. The problem is, I think we're declaring some folks, the representative was using the kind of the wound versus disabled dichotomy, and when you don't treat wounds quickly enough, they do become disabilities, and then when they do, sometimes they turn into problems that prevent you from working. So I have no problem with providing some income net to veterans who truly can't work, except I think there are so few of them who truly can't.
Just one,
this poor gentleman that remember I said I
okay.
wait till next, thank you.
All right.
Good afternoon. My name's Joel. If you recall the question I asked for the earlier panel, I'm volunteering with a couple of organizations in Ukraine, and they basically have a blank slate when it comes to their veteran support infrastructure. And so the question I want to ask you gentlemen, or anybody else who'd like to chat with me afterwards, is what are some wise best practices and principles that I can take with me to my colleagues in Ukraine from the American experience of caring for people coming home from war?
One of the really exciting things about working in this field, I've worked with a lot of different nonprofits and foundations that support them when it comes to veterans, is kind of the growth of a lot of what I think have been come to call sort of empowerment organizations. So they look at veterans coming back as assets to their community, as resources for the rest of the country to really draw on. There's some great work by an organization called Got Your Six that sort of looks at this question. But to give you an example, there are a number of organizations whose sole purpose is to get veterans together to do community service projects and community revitalization projects to respond to disasters. I think things like that that may not be sort of explicitly focused on treating a particular health condition, but that are actually focused on sort of building ties between veterans and then building ties between those veterans and the places that they are, that the places they come home to, are really powerful and important. And it also provides structure to people, social structure to people's lives.
So I know a little bit about Ukraine, which is to say it's dangerous that I know a little, but I'll still, as a good think tanker, I'll still spout off. In Ukraine, the parts of the military that were before the revolution that were heavily funded, heavily trained, was the National Guard, not the Army. And so and of course, the folks that are doing the fighting in the East are now the Army. And so it's quite striking in Ukraine how much of that army is a volunteer army now. I mean, the National Guard guys were the guys that were shooting people in the streets, and the army is the one that's sort of defending the nation. And they're seen as, good patriots. Given Ukraine's history of corruption, I think the worst thing that could possibly happen is to try to create a government service for the veterans there, because it'll get eaten up in some sort of scheme. But the good news about Ukraine is, despite all its problems, it has an incredibly vibrant civil society. And so the lesson I take from both the discussion before and today, I mean, on this panel, is the degree that you can tap into that civil society for veteran efforts and veteran services is the way to go in Ukraine. Well, we've got lessons learned. Let's try to put them in place in a place like Ukraine. Final comment. So much of the discussion, I think, both what Congressman had to say in the first and second panels is, there is this divide, it's stronger or worse, depending on who you talk to, between the larger public and the all-volunteer force and the veterans. But I just want to point out one of the things that my colleague, Rebecca Burgess, has been doing has been tracking the revival of veterans entering into political life. I mean, of course, it was, as one would expect, given the numbers, it was a drop-off after the World War II generation began to die, and because of Vietnam, there were fewer veterans that went into politics. But that trend line has begun to tick back up. And it's kind of an interesting phenomenon when you think about sort of like, particularly Congress, which probably has the lowest, ratings among the American public in terms of being respected. And then you have the institution that's the most respected is the military. It'll be interesting to see over the next few years as more and more veterans go into Congress and the state legislatures, how much knowledge they bring about veterans affairs into those bodies to help sort of, again, address some of these really important public policy issues with helping veterans get both what's due to them, but also make sure the policies aren't doing more harm than good. So if you'll join me in thanking our panelists and also everybody else who's participated. Thank you.